It's a kind of bizarre thing to think about, and kind of it's a funny image. You have to laugh, but it's so like it's a kind of a very dark future, right?
Well, there's a real lack of intellectual humility. There's behind these converging ideologies, if you will, and converging uses of technologies. I think there is a lack of self-awareness and understanding, first of all, that the world is enormously and beautifully complex and complicated. And the sort of hyper-rationalist ideology says, no, we can figure everything out, and then we can put the really smart people into positions of permanent power, and they can, in a top-down sort of managerialist control, organized fashion, tell everyone what to do, and figure out all the dangers and minimize them, and kind of refine all the pleasures and maximize them. And it's a very naive view of the cosmos and of the world that we live in, and the immediate lived environment, which is enormously complex beyond our reckoning, and beautifully beyond our ability to fully comprehend it. So science, and I should say, and I'm sure Matthias would say the same thing, both of us are a fan of science as a process for discovering more and learning more about the natural world. And I'm not opposed to technology as a way of managing our lives and the environment. But to put those things at the service of human beings, and to put those things at the service of the actual complex world in which we live in, is going to require a very, very different approach than the one that the path that we seem to be going down now.
No, yes, the strangest thing is that I know no major scientists who are rationalists. All major scientists, that's exactly what they conclude, that the essence of everything you study always transcends rational understanding. That's the strangest thing. But in a strange way, while in the beginning, I believe scientific discourse initially, 16th century for instance, I believe that scientific discourse initially was a fine example of truth-telling, truth speech. It was a small minority of people who went against a dominant discourse, which had become, in many respects, a dogmatic religious discourse. So, and this small group of people went against it. And that's exactly what truth speech does. It destroys a common illusion. But as science, as a consequence of the first scientific discoveries, became dominant in society, as scientific discourse slowly became dominant, and that's what always happens with discourses that become dominant, it got perverted. Yep. Of course, because people started to use scientific discourse to make a career, to earn money, and the discourse got perverted. That's what always happens. Most discourses start as truth speech, and they turn into the opposite, into a fake discourse. And then that's one important thing. That is something that happened in science. And somewhere along the road, science, and now I think now in the academic world, what the academic world produces now, for me, has nothing to do anymore with truth speech. Or sometimes it happens, exceptionally.
Right.
And let me add one more thing to that. Another very important phenomenon is the following. Like, as soon as science emerged, and in its wake, the rationalist, materialist view on the world emerged, people started to believe that rational understanding should be the guiding principle in life, that we should not think in the first place about whether something we did was good or wrong in a moral and ethical context. No, we started to think what was the smartest way to do. And so, as rational knowledge accumulated, our ethical awareness declined. And the combination of the two is extremely dangerous, because rational knowledge, accumulation of rational knowledge makes you more powerful. It gives you more power. And if your ethical awareness at the same time declines, you have the recipe for evil on earth.
Yeah.
And that's what happens. But the first thing you could see was that these Western countries who had this scientific knowledge at their disposal, they started to colonize the world, for instance, started to use it to oppress others, and so on and so on. So
well, Auschwitz itself was a hyper-rationalized environment of hyper-efficient death, as were the atomic bombs that we built during World War II, as maybe premier examples of what you're describing there. And I think we've moved now, especially in the context of institutionalized science and higher education, moved away from authentic science and the ideal of science as the disinterested and self-skeptical pursuit of knowledge and hypothesis and testing and refutation. We've moved away from science into ideology that I call scientism, which is different than science. And scientism is the non-scientific claim smuggled through the back door that science is the only valid form of knowledge. And that claim contradicts itself, because science is the only valid form of knowledge is itself not a scientific claim. It's a metaphysical claim that attempts to hide itself. But the exclusion of moral knowledge, the exclusion of religious, spiritual, moral, metaphysical perspectives, the diminution of the humanities, of the arts and of literature and so forth in the context of what's really important in our education system. All of this points to a kind of totalitarian conception of science, where science attempts, or people attempt to monopolize what counts as knowledge and rationality in the name of science. And of course, when you do this, you can anoint whoever you want to be the spokesperson for science, bringing, the unassailable conclusions down from on high. And you get people saying, people in positions of authority in our society saying absurd things like, I am the science and he who questions me questions the science, which no real credible scientist would ever dream of saying such an absurdity. And so I think it's important, so as not to throw out the baby with the bathwater, that we draw this distinction between science as a method and as a way of life, almost as a mindset, and a particular pursuit that is good, and scientism, which is hardened into an exclusionary, monopolistic ideology that has actually nothing to do with a disinterested pursuit of truth and everything to do with deploying power in a very authoritarian way.
Is it a foregone conclusion that, as the rational view of the human being, or perhaps the universe entirely, grows, the moral view declines? Or can there be a synergy?
For me, it's you said the rational view. It's important to mention that for me, a rational view is completely opposite of a rationalist view. That's a strange thing. Like, rationalism is the illusion that ultimately you can grasp the essence of the world, of nature, of everything around us in rational categories. That's not true. Science rejected that idea. The essence of things always transcends rational understanding. But so the strange thing is, as soon as you fall prey to that illusion, as soon as you fall prey to the belief that through your rational understanding you will be capable of controlling and manipulating everything, you will be capable of becoming God. Read, for instance, Harari, his Homo Deus. Yeah. That's rationalism. The belief that in the end you will be capable of understanding, controlling, and manipulating the essence of life. And that's, strangely enough, this rationalist illusion always leads humanity into the complete absurdity.
Yeah.
For instance, of totalitarian systems. It leads to complete irrationality. If you're really loyal to rational understanding and walk the path, the way of rationality, step by step, you will soon arrive at the end where you will see this is the limit of rational understanding. Here we have to move on. Here we have to find a new way of knowing, which is this Einfühlung where Einstein talked about. It's this sixth sense where Samurai culture talked about. It's everyone knows that the real knowledge transcends rational knowledge. So that's something extremely important, I think. I consider myself to be very, very rational, but I'm not a rationalist, not at all.
Right.
So I think that's one thing that is important to mention, I believe. Like, real science has nothing to do with the rational. To the contrary, it's opposite to rational.
It involves, there's an aesthetic dimension to science. I mean, Einstein himself talked about seeing the truth of his theory of relativity and his great contribution to science, and embracing it not because he had irrefutable experimental proof for it. That actually came later. That was some experiments done at the University of Washington that having to do with light being bent by gravity that confirmed his theory. But he embraced the theory initially because he said it was beautiful. Not because he had irrefutable experiment, because it was beautiful. Because it was intuitively elegant. Because, you know, as he liked to put it, God did not play dice with the universe because of his, I mean, it was almost a mystical intuition. And then you can ask, well, how do, you know, we have the scientific method, but how do good scientists generate good hypotheses? You stop and think about that for a moment, right? The process of generating a good hypothesis, something that hasn't yet been demonstrated by an experiment, that has to involve some, it's not irrational, but some non-rational or supra-rational, intuitive, feeling toward, empathetic, something with the subject that you've been studying that most scientists probably couldn't put it into words and describe it to you, or it probably would be difficult to teach unless you've got a knack for this sort of thing.
You need sincerity.
Yes.
That's something that Einstein literally said in a foreword of a book of Max Planck. He said, many people think that science is born from rational thinking. It's not, he said. It's born from a capacity for Einfühlung, which is a German term which means feeling one or feeling into what you observe. And in a talk, in a speech he gave at a certain American university, I forgot which one exactly, maybe it was Harvard, I'm not sure. He said, I believe he said, that the best starting point for science is a cosmic religious awareness.
Yeah. Yeah, that's right.
Exactly. And as you said, like, relativity theory was not born from experimenting or rational considerations. It was born from a certain intuition, from a certain feeling for aesthetical, sublime theory. Yes.
So art and science are perhaps less real science, not so much of the fake nonsense that is churned out in our so-called peer-reviewed journals today, but real science, real very significant contributions to our understanding of things, is perhaps not as far apart from art, let's say, or even religion as our contemporary ideologies might have us think.
I want to build on, we have a few minutes left. I want to build on this concept of sincerity that you mentioned. It seems to me like a lot of things boil down to people acting with sincerity and figuring out what that means in this strange technology, lonely, mediated world that we live in. And there seems to be, at least to my eye, a significant lack of that. And you seek it, you know it when you see it, and you go after it because you're missing it. At least that's what it's like for me. Maybe we're going to build a bit more on this, what you mean by this sort of finding the sincerity that you...
Yes, somewhere in the beginning of our conversation, I referred to the fact that loneliness and narcissism are actually two branches of the same tree, that they are both a consequence of human rationalist hubris, that automatically this rationalism leads to two things, like interconnected things, loneliness or disconnectedness and narcissism. And indeed, like what we've seen throughout the last 200 years is a triumph of the ego. Like the ego became more and more powerful in the world. That means this identification of the human being with its own outer, socially rewarded, ideal image. So that ego emerged became stronger and stronger throughout the last centuries, and sincerity is exactly the act through which you punch a hole in your ego. Literally, speaking sincerely means that you reveal something, that you show something that doesn't match the ideal image, something people usually hide behind their outer ideal image. And you can almost feel that physically. My next book is about that. You can almost feel it physically. Sometimes you are in a situation, social situation, you feel like, oh, everyone is buying into this, but I do not agree. And you feel it doesn't feel well. And if you take this courageous decision then to say, I will articulate what I feel, you know two things. You will destroy your ideal image in that group. You know that you will say something that destroys the socially shared ideal image. And that's really the act. You feel it almost physically, in which you push something that resonates in your body through the outer ideal image. You literally punch a hole in your outer ideal image, in your ego. And then the effect is that there is usually, if the other people can open themselves a little bit, can put aside their own prejudices and clinging to social ideal images and stuff, if they can open a little bit, you will see how the words that you articulated from the resonating strings of your body go through the hole in father's ego and make him resonate. And that's connection. That's why truth connects people. It creates true social bond. And that's why sincerity is the only remedy for a society sick of lies, propaganda, manipulation, deception, and so on and so on. So,
and that the possibility for that relies on a more ancient philosophical doctrine that all of us participate in, a shared. Well, the Greek word was logos, which sometimes would be translated as shared rationality, but it's sometimes translated as word, order, reason, intelligibility. All of us participate in a transcendent logos that allows us to communicate with one another, to engage in a shared, sincere pursuit of truth, and allows us to communicate that and to share that in a non-coercive way, that the authentic pursuit and finding of truth does not happen through coercion. It doesn't need the methods of propaganda. When the light of my intellect sees that 2 + 2 is 4, or Matthias demonstrates for me a proof of the Pythagorean theorem, and the light goes on, and I see that it must be so, that light of truth compels my intellect, but without forcing my will. Right? It's compelling, but in a way that respects my freedom. I think the contemporary crisis that we are currently facing in the world, aspects of which we sort of touched on in this interview, is also an opportunity, because many people are hungry for that. Many people have grown kind of sick and nauseated by a steady diet of propaganda that somewhere deep inside, intuitively, they know is not right, even if they feel that they have to parrot these falsehoods. And that act that you described so beautifully of taking off the mask and sincerely speaking the truth, which may be very simple in a particular situation. It may be just stepping out of a group and saying, no, we can't do that. That's wrong. That's not okay. Because that's not what we do to people, or, just speaking some simple moral truth that everyone in the room ought to know, but no one is acknowledging for whatever reason, because of institutional or social forces or ideological forces that are getting in the way. That's very attractive. People are hungry. And I think if courageous people begin trying to live in that way, that will grow. People will find one another. And we can then begin to create small communities of people who who are trying to live differently.
Yes, I agree. We have to practice the art of sincere speech with the same perseverance as the samurai practiced in martial arts. Step by step, growing, becoming stronger, as Mahatma Gandhi did. Step by step, every day again, try to become more sincere. Try to practice the art of sincere speech. I was wondering, Aaron, would there be something we disagree about, you think? Could we find something?
Well, I don't know. Maybe if we started talking about God, we might find some disagreements. We haven't gone there yet. Yeah, we'll definitely have to do this again.
By the way, we could unpack what you said about logos. Also very interesting is the Greek concept of parrhesia, bold speech in public space, which always is very risky, the ancient Greeks said. The one who speaks the truth might be hated. There is a good chance because he destroys the illusions people find their stability in, so they will be angry with him. But if there is nobody anymore, the ancient Greeks said, who lives up to the ethical duty of parrhesia, of speaking out these painful truths in public space, the polis or the society is ready for the plague.
Should we give a homework assignment to all of us here to what is the sincere?
Well, I've been working a lot, and we've talked, Jan, about the issue of government censorship. And I've talked about it in relation to totalitarianism, that the starting point for all totalitarianism is the prohibition of questions and the prohibition of dissent and the monopolizing of what counts as knowledge by the ideology, and then excluding people who voice dissenting opinions. And at the end point of that process, the external concentration camps and mass surveillance and secret police are no longer necessary because people have so internalized the ideology that a perfected totalitarian system wouldn't require those external sort of forcible methods of conformity, because everyone is informing on everyone else, everyone's surveilling everyone else. And
and everyone's kind of controlling themselves to not do that.
Right. They're self-censoring. So a practical homework assignment is to notice times when you don't say what you think. I'm not advocating that you say every thought that comes into your head all the time in every social situation. Obviously, there's discretion, there's propriety, there's all, but I think we have gone very far down the path of getting to the point where in certain social situations, we almost never say what we think on really important matters. And we restrict ourselves to trivialities. And so recognizing when there may be moments where, no, this is a time for me to actually say what I believe to be the case. And it may feel a little bit risky, and it may have negative social consequences, actually. But in a society where no one does that, we are ripe for misery, and we're perfect fodder for authoritarian rulers to exercise totalitarian forms of control. So push back against self-censorship. Notice when you're biting your tongue simply to go along, to get along, and find ways here and there strategically to try to push back against that and to engage in the kind of sincere speech that Matthias described so beautifully.
Matthias, a final thought?
Well, it's just simple as that, I think, that every time you speak sincerely, you inevitably will go through the dark night of the soul, to use a concept of the great mysticist
John of the Cross.
Yes, John of the Cross, yes. Thank you, St. John of the Cross, yes. And it means that you will always, if you speak sincerely, you will inevitably lose something in the world of appearances.
Yeah.
And you will win something in the real world.
Right.
You have to accept that. And go for the real world.
Well, Matthias Desmet, Aaron Cariotti, such a pleasure to have had you on together.
Thank you.
Likewise. Thanks for having me.
Thank you all for joining Aaron Cariotti, Matthias Desmet, and me on this episode of American Thought Leaders. I'm your host, Janja Kellick.